All right, everyone. My name is Anthony Costello, and this is the Equal Justice Podcast, which is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. I'm joined today with my colleague, Logan Zeppieri. And Logan, today we are going to be doing part 2 of a series of essays by Dr. Nathan Cartagena, assistant professor of philosophy at the prestigious Christian institution known as Wheaton University. Is it a university or is it a college? It's a university, right? Wheaton. Yeah, anyways,
I think so, college.
Very prestigious, one of the obviously more well-known Christian schools of higher education in the country. And Dr. Cartagena has graced us with a series of essays that he at least believes will clarify for us what critical race theory is, and also attempt to show that it's compatible with Christianity in some way. Although we still haven't really, we don't feel that we've really discovered that connection yet, or that compatibility yet. We do know that Dr. Cartagena is working towards a book-length treatment of critical race theory, and we have posted another video on one of the panel discussions of which he was a member recently, that was put out by the CCCU. So you can also watch our analysis of that panel discussion, which was with 4 other advocates of critical race theory and its compatibility, and even with biblical Christianity, even its use in evangelism. So anyways, before we get to part 2 of Dr. Cartagena's essays, which is entitled "What Christians Get Wrong About Critical Race Theory," Logan, I just wanted to open up with a quote from a book that I pulled off my bookshelf. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to read the quote at first, and then I'm going to give the source of the quote. But let me just try this out. So I quote from this book: "The Western approach has always assumed that radical change can be brought about by changing the environment. This is why emphasis has always been placed on change in structure. This approach has failed to produce proper results. It has ignored the need to bring about change within men and women themselves, and has concentrated on change in the outside world. What is needed, however, is a total change within people themselves, as well as in their social environment. The problem is not merely structural, although structural arrangements would also have to be remodeled. But the starting point must be the hearts and souls of men and women, their perception of reality, and their own place and mission in life." End quote. Now, I'll post that in so people can read that. But that seems to be a sentiment there, an idea that I think any biblical Christian, any historical Christian would wholeheartedly be able to affirm, that there are structural issues in society, but the starting point for any change in the structure or superstructure or environment is the hearts and souls of men and women.
Yes, and I think Christians, as well as people who are involved with foreign policy and statecraft, would also agree. You see a lot of these state building projects where if we just institute a particular kind of government structure, then certain, I guess, international conduct would emerge. And we've seen that time and again not work in a variety of different ways. It definitely comes down to the individual.
Now, what this author does not reject the idea that structures would have to be remodeled as hearts and minds and souls of people are changed. But he does say that the problem in the West has been that the emphasis has been on changing the structure. In emphasizing changing the structure, these never produce the proper results. Now, I'll go ahead and reveal the source here, which is the introduction to a classic work called Towards Understanding Islam by Maulana Maududi, who was a Pakistani scholar. And that introduction was written in 1940, I believe. And sorry, that introduction was written by Khurshid Ahmad in 1979 from Islamabad, Pakistan, for the Institute of Policy Studies. And the reason I open up with that quote from the introduction to Maududi's classic work on Toward Understanding Islam is because I think when we get into critical theories more generally, which Dr. Cartagena wants to work within this tradition of critical theories, and again, we've talked about sort of the lineage going back to the Frankfurt School, and then even further back to Marx himself and Engels. I think as biblical Christians, we are further away epistemically and ontologically in our views from any critical race theory than we are from a fundamentalist Islamic text like this one. Because once we traffic, and I pointed this out last one, is when we traffic in social theories like these, critical theories are social theories, it is just the society, and I quoted Max Horkheimer in one of our previous episodes, it is just societies that define social realities. Okay, there's nothing transcendent to the society. There's nothing transcendent to the social group in hegemonic power who gets to determine basically everything about social reality that then everybody else lives in. Okay, so we're going to have to take a lot of, I think, Dr. Cartagena's essay here with a grain of salt if he's only trafficking in the realm of social theory. And one of the things I noticed is in one of the epigraphs in part 2 of the essay, he quotes Ian Lopez here, who says, and I quote, "Race may be the U.S.'s single most confounding problem, but the founding problem of race is that few people seem to know what race is." So again, here, what's going to even define race or racism, according to the critical theorist, is just, whatever the current society says race or racism is. All right.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things that you've said that's important that I think we need to magnify for the audience. The first one is when we talk about how different the sort of these social theories looking at society as a sort of like almost personifying or institutionalizing society as a unit versus the individual. That shift isn't just saying, oh, we're looking at the individual versus looking at society. It's a very small shift, as evidenced from the quote you just you had given. And we talked about this even before we started recording, is it would seem in some ways you'll see sort of Orthodox Christian views more similar to Islamic views than it is with critical race theory views or Marxist views, where they're shifting and saying it's actually societal structures, not the individual in which we ground society in. Mm-hmm. Now, the second thing is you brought up is the definition of race, and we were also talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and that is if there's no objective way in which we can define things, and we'll talk about this in Nunn's paper or Noon's paper in a little bit, there's no objective perspective, if there's no analytic method, the question then is how does an agreement concerning what is race come about? Is it just whoever lives longest? Is it just ever who finds enough people to agree with you? Does it come down to just whoever's in power? That's who gets to define race?
Right. Or and this is obviously in a lot of Alistair McIntyre's books, which is, the problem of emotivism or, expressivism as a moral theory. Is it just sort of our emotions that, as Hume would have put it, the passions, just whatever our feelings at the time are, we sort of create definitions that seem to be sort of in line with those feelings. But of course, that's usually going to presuppose that there's a will behind any theory that's sort of manipulating or driving those emotions and trying to get people to feel a certain way so that a given definition that's proffered will be accepted. And that's something that we've seen play out in popular culture, everything all the way to, when you get like a popular commentator like Ben Shapiro, saying facts don't care about your feelings. He is saying something true there, because we're seeing sort of feelings about things be considered determinative of truth, right?
Yeah. Well, and this is where Nathan mentioned it a few times in his previous essay, that there's no consensus. But I do, on the definition of race, but I do think it's a legitimate question to say, okay, does critical race theory provide any structural, theoretical roads to coming to agreement?
Right.
It seems like the answer is no.
Right.
At least in the rational discourse. I think when we talk about race, we have an analytic understanding, or we have an objective way of measuring it. Race is where we can see the actions of an individual affecting the actions of another individual. That's not a definition that the critical race theorists would agree to. Some of them might, but there's no way to determine which one of those are right or which definition is preferable.
Well, I tell you, let's give a quick rundown, and then, because I do think what we probably need to get to specific. I mean, Dr. Cartagena links to a number of books and articles in this essay, in this part of the essay in particular. And now, one of the critiques that you've made is that some of the links, at least in the current version of this essay, are just to entire books, which makes it very difficult to kind of understand what particularly maybe somebody like Locke said, if he's just linking to like,
Second Treatise on Government. Yeah, some
like
huge,
hundreds of pages long. And one of the concerns that we have in general, again, not trying to levy any unjust critiques, but it is a concern, is a sort of selective treatment of what some of the, great thinkers of Western European history have said, people like Locke and others, and whether or not there's sort of a picking and choosing, because the critical race theory framework is already presupposed, and then that has to be supported by just picking and choosing the citations from these European thinkers of the day that sort of fit the bill. But go ahead.
I think we could just begin with Kenneth Noon's quote,
we got to get
and then
to
even
none.
or not. Is it Nunn or Noon?
Well, I'm going to say Nunn, because there was a great former middleweight boxer by the name of Michael Nunn, and his name is spelled N-U-N-N. So I'm going to say
then we'll go
Nunn.
then we'll go with Nunn. And there's the justification for it too.
Yeah. Because this
first quote
seems to be the standout thing here is Kenneth Nunn's essay. And let's get the title of that one. Do you have in front of you?
Yeah, it's Law as a Eurocentric Enterprise.
Right.
The quote is, law organizes white society, then it helps maintain that society through both physical and ideological coercion. Now, I think what's important is, I don't see it happening yet. We brought up the concern last essay is Nathan trying to, I guess, in a way, Christianize or make critical race theory harmonious with certain Christian doctrines? And so far, we haven't seen that. And I thought it was important to go over this citation specifically because, A, he gives, Nunn gives some concrete examples. And second, I think he unfolds a lot of the concerns we have to a greater degree than is led on initially in the paper that Nathan writes. For example, just within a few pages of the essay, he talks about how laws are a expression of certain cultures or a type of culture. So there's no such thing as a law that could be applied to one culture and then also applied to another culture. He talks about how
or if they have been, it's been through
coercion and ideological
coercion and not
power.
because the other culture in any way agreed that the law was principled or just or even pragmatic, that maybe that law just led to a better functioning of society.
Yeah. And then how he defines culture, because the first question is, and this is a question I think every metaphysician would ask, okay, what's a culture? And how he defines culture is just something that society, a belief of that society that's sort of agreed upon, which is already problematic, because when you argue that a society is racist, the question then becomes, okay, then what about the beliefs of the individuals who don't agree? So for example, I think Jacob and other podcasts have brought this up, but the problem of the moral reformer.
The reformer problem, dilemma.
Yeah, it becomes, okay, so is he also a racist because he's product of a social situation? So you already have so already you have the idea that a society is hegemonic in some way. You can describe that hegemonic expression in a way that accurately describes the individuals within that society.
Right. And it's also, of course, simplistic, and it doesn't take into account, you could very well have the majority of a given culture thinking very differently than those in power over the majority, right? So you could have a predominantly European culture where just numbers wise, the majority of people believe very differently from the small oligarchy that rules over them. So which is the culture? Is it the small oligarchy ruling over them, creating the laws? Or is it the majority of the people who are part of the same society, maybe have the same skin color and other in similar cultural forms with the elite perhaps, but it's the elite who are creating the laws.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And I think this is where, I originally started, my kind of entering into social critique was through Hayek's work, and he denies this term social as far as creating an entity. And so I thought, well, this seems to make sense. But the critique, though, I think ends up becoming more and more important, because we see this with like statistical analysis, and there's a ton of evidence on this when you run statistical analyses, that you end up creating in some instances representations that are not descriptive of the events, or they're not prima facie able to be utilized. So for example, when you talk about a whole society's collective beliefs, there is a strong argument to say that because it describes so much, there's a good likelihood it doesn't describe any one particular belief within that society, or in a statistical analysis, any particular event. So when the average person doesn't exist, right? Is kind of the rub of it. And there's a lot of analyses on that.
That's funny, because in Nunn's article, one of the things that he criticizes as a feature of Eurocentricity is abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But then, of course, if he's coming up with 7 features of Eurocentricity that somehow describe European culture, what's he doing? He's abstracting, right? Because he's just, he's coming up with concepts that he feels are somehow, there were all kinds of problems in Nunn's article. That was maybe one of the hardest ones to look at. Not that I read the whole thing, but so
he goes on to say that things like racism, colonialism, group-based suppression, sexism, these are all fundamental features of European law, or countries that are derived from European
aggression. So
which seems to be at its face value not entirely correct. You have the Mongolian Empire, which was the largest contiguous empire the world's ever seen, which was not Western Europe.
Well, and
questions about Egyptian empires,
the emergence of Islam on the scene, which could not be
Ottoman Empire,
a European product, I mean, I don't see how Muhammad and his successors could be seen as a product of anything European in culture. And they conquered more land mass in 80 years than the Roman Empire did in 700 years. So aggression just seems to be like slapped on there again as a rhetorical device. Just because
Yeah,
it
well, there's
sounds
nothing that where does it like link up to? He doesn't give any examples of uniquely European aggression that would be distinct from maybe Japanese aggression against China during World War II, or
just more ancient. I mean, we talked about Aztec, the Aztec Empire.
Yeah, Aztec and Mayan. Yeah, obviously had no connection to European culture prior to.
So I mean, some of these, again, they're difficult to digest as actual like truth-oriented theories, as opposed to more rhetorical ways of trying to I think, again, do what you've been getting onto, sort of just shift the power over to our side.
Yeah, and because there's no real, I think, analysis of I think important questions, like because I think there are certain things he gets right. Are there laws that are cultural? I think so.
Sure.
Traffic laws are a perfect example from the United States to England, just within the Western world, let alone non-Western civilizations where maybe traffic laws are a little more relaxed. Or I remember I was looking at like the requirements of headlights and taillights in the United States. It doesn't seem like it applies in certain other countries in Africa or in Asia. So it's, well, so there are, I think, a legitimacy in saying there are cultural laws. I think the question, though, is, are there laws that are not cultural? So questions like not murdering, like murdering is a crime. Right. Are we going to say that's just a cultural phenomenon, which it seems like a lot of people agree on? You can see how certain laws and then the moral aspect of those laws tend to now lock horns, and you have to ask the question: if laws are cultural, then do the moral values which those laws are supposed to express also cultural?
Right. And I mean, I think some laws, I mean, it's another way to look at this problem of sort of saying, hey, and do you have the 7, I think there are 7 characteristic features of Eurocentricity that none.
Yes, I have that.
Why don't you go ahead and read those off, and then.
So the first one is dichotomous reasoning. The second one is employment of hierarchies.
Right.
The third one is analytical thought. The fourth one is objectification. The fifth one is abstraction. 6 is extreme rationalism. Some of these I'm not sure if they're necessarily
different.
Yes.
So like, distinctions without a difference especially between dichotomous thinking, analytical thought, and extreme rationalism. Now, this is based, I mean, I think anybody in the natural sciences should immediately be bracing when they read these articles and essays by critical race theorists, and this, of course, we're seeing this play out, because a lot of, I mean, the idea here, which I think is kind of crazy, and I think it's also ridiculous to think that other cultures outside of Europe didn't already have these modes of thinking and reasoning in place prior to colonialism.
Yeah. Even just real quick, 7 is, just so we can get all of them out on the table, is desacralization.
Okay, and that's an interesting one. I actually might agree with him on that one to some degree, that last point, just in virtue of my reading of Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, where he talks about, the not desacralization, but the what does he call it? The mythification, and that's Boltzmann's term. I can't remember the term right now, but where he talks about the disenchantment. I think he's drawing off of Fromm there, or Weber, the idea of we're living in this disenchanted world, which is very different from pre-16th century, even pre-16th century Europe, where, nature's objects were enchanted with supernatural or spiritual powers and abilities. Okay. Now, whether or not people in the critical race theorists in the line of Marx would want to go back to something like viewing nature as infused with spiritual powers, I find that a stretch. I don't see many critical race theorists wanting to embrace the sacralization or the supernaturalization of nature again. But one could make an argument that through the Enlightenment and the rise of the scientific method and the dominance of the natural sciences in the last 300 to 400 years in the West, that has in some sense contributed to this desacralization of how we view nature or, God's world, to put it more simply.
Yeah.
But, these three ways of thinking, analytical thought, which I think he describes as breaking things down into their smallest parts and analyzing them piecemeal. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean there hasn't been more holistic, ways of thinking in the West either. Of course there have been. Certainly Spinoza would be one example. I don't know if Spinoza might be one of those outliers. I guess even though we would disagree with him on his metaphysics. And then of course now the overemphasis on rationality, instrumental reasoning. Now this does go back to the Frankfurt School thinkers broadly, I believe, where there were critiques about from Horkheimer and Adorno and others about how the instrumental use of reason, seeing things, and even C.S. Lewis makes this point, right? In Men Without, opening chapter of Abolition of Man, the scientific perspective of seeing everything in just through the third person lens of analysis and description.
Yeah.
Right. And I think anybody holding to a Christian worldview would be able to say, yeah, I mean, there's a place to critique that and to be wary of a sort of scientism.
Yeah.
To think
and
exhaustively describe reality just through instrumental reason, a la A.J. Ayers, the logical positivists, or the Richard today.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those things, like, we get it, but again, I think what we're pushing back on is whether or not these are exclusive to European culture, which I don't think they're exclusive in any way. I think you'll find these in any culture. And then, of course, you're not going to just get rid of these either. It's not like...
dichotomous reasoning.
Yeah.
This goes into computer science, which is fundamentally dichotomous reasoning.
Binary coding. My father knew my father knew personally Claude Shannon.
Okay.
Who developed information theory and was basically able to codicize natural language into a series of binary units, zeros and ones. Everything could be transmitted binarily. Binarily, I don't know if that's a word, but so
yeah. Well, some of these things, I think what they get at, I think at like face value, you could say, okay, are there instances in which dichotomous reasoning is bad? Absolutely. Are there situations in which employments of hierarchies are bad? Yeah, it seems like each of these points, there is immediately something comes to mind where this could be used poorly. But I think it goes too far to say, it's primarily European. It seems like there might be some trafficking in certain anthropological commitments there that I don't think are true. It's not as though people in Africa are unable to do any of these things. The question, though, is
never did prior to colonialization. As if
exactly. Questions like objectification, for example, like as C.S. Lewis talks about, when he talks about in cosmic trilogy or the space trilogy, the emptying out of the universe when you make it just objects, and it's no longer, as you said, this sort of like mythic sort of understanding of how the world works and why it's, why cause and effect is more mysterious than it is. But there are critiques of that even with the Western tradition during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers from Hume and Kant. And like, that's one of the biggest arguments is, how do you understand cause and effect?
Yeah.
So there's just a lot missing. And so they're taking a slice and saying, again, and I think this goes back to how we opened up part of the this episode, is it seems like they're taking a slice of it and they're saying, this is the cultural belief. And we're saying, well, it doesn't seem like it's fitting very nicely as a description of Enlightenment thinkers per se, or as Western society, so to speak. Then even Jordan Peterson, he was recently doing just a conversation on hierarchies, because there's this view that if there's any form of societal hierarchy, it's bad. But he gives a story of an individual who did come from a society who has kind of these broad, social hierarchies and certain conventions. And this person related something very similar, like when you arrive at a bus stop and it says that it will arrive at 10 a.m. and the bus arrives there at 10 a.m. So it was mind-blowing that the society has a particular kind of structure that things like reliability start forming, which isn't just a Western tradition, but B, doesn't seem like something that's inherently, anti-humane or white or anti-black or anything like that. It's a question of, can you utilize certain things in certain ways that are profitable to society? And hierarchy seems to be one way in which we can do that.
Well, I tell you, I mean, again, taking at least 2 of those 7 that none lies out. And again, this is none is quoted a few times or referenced at least a few times in Nathan's essay here. So we're assuming that Nathan is in agreement with none. We haven't seen him critique none so far, and I don't think he does in the 3rd essay either, if I recall. But if there's agreement by our critical race theory friends who are in the church, that things like dichotomous thinking or hierarchies are problematic, then to me, if hierarchy and dichotomous thinking are problematic, then I might as well just chuck my Bible out the window right now. Because I don't know, now you might want to, as a Protestant, say, look, what we mean is the sort of hierarchy that started in or around 312, when there was this synthesis between the Roman Empire under Constantine and the church. Okay, fine. That's one way you could go, that we don't want to be Roman Catholics and have like a magisterium with the Pope at the head, and we don't want that sort of in bed with the secular magistrate. But I don't know. I mean, hierarchy in general. I mean, what is our metaphysics again informing us here? Like, what is our Christian metaphysics? Because there just is hierarchy, right? Metaphysics.
Yeah, and they assault, or I mean, if you want to use that kind of language, they do push against this idea of hierarchies into better and worse, which seems to be the foundation of law, that there are worse and less worse crime, less bad crimes. Murder is worse than theft. That seems to be a hierarchy of better and worse. So it's really getting down to the fundamentals of law, gets to the fundamentals of, as you said, biblical hierarchies, where it seems like there are certain things it's better to give to the poor than to kill your neighbor.
Yeah. Right. I mean, those are moral truths, but then also just there is a metaphysical hierarchy. I mean, we cannot reject hierarchy as Christians. I mean, it's just that might be the Marxist utopia, but it's not the Christian utopia.
No.
Now moving on from none, although there was a lot there in those 7 features of Eurocentric whiteness.
And I just, as we move on, a quick comment. The reason we spent time on this article is to at least let the listeners know that this is the kind of the background we're dealing with. It's not, oppressing people's wrong, we disagree. It's like, no, there's actually an entire theory here that's saying things like, dichotomous thinking is wrong. That's what's
Yeah.
being trafficked in to a theory like this that you have to address.
Dichotomous thinking is wrong, and it's solely a product of European culture after in or around the 15th or early 16th century that did go on to colonize and dominate physically much of the world, much of the
Yeah.
globe,
And even
mainly through the British Empire, but not solely through the British Empire. But
and even if you like the law thing, like
Right.
does the 10 Commandments, is that a cultural expression? Like you get some fundamental questions that's like, wow, is this as far as we're going to go? And if you say no, then what in critical theory prevents that move from being
Well,
made?
and this was an issue we raised when we watched some of the panel discussion with that Raymond Chang moderated between contextual theologians and correlation theologians. And the distinction I was trying, how far back do we take this? Are the Christians going to say, well, it is societies and cultures that sort of produce knowledge. That's another thing. It's knowledge production. It's not grasping knowledge in classical theory or classical philosophy. It's the mind grasping knowledge. Here, it's minds collectively producing knowledge, right? And so how far back are we going to take this understanding of reality being constructed by societies? Because if we take it all the way back into the biblical texts themselves, then you're not doing contextual theology anymore, you're doing correlation theology. And those texts are all contingent. They're all just based on the culture of the day that produced them and what their views of reality were. Our views are very different now. So therefore, what is the universal and fixed content of the Bible? It's whatever the majority says it is today.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So if you can have multiple competing theologies, none of which is true or truer than the other. They're just whichever theology wins out at the end of the day, because I guess it has the most adherents. That's the true one, So that's just not Orthodox Christianity anymore. I mean, we should point that out.
Yeah. And that's why it's important.
Because there's no revelation. I mean, revelation is at best something like, an inscrutable divine, maybe it's more Hegelian, some kind of like God evolving with us, into some kind of omega point. That's the omega point wasn't Hegel, but who was the Jesuit theologian who came up with that? Chardin. So okay, then God is really not transcendent. He's evolving along with us, and every generation is just doing its sort of best guess at what God is, what morality is, and so on and so forth. And I think that's something to point out with any of these critical race theorists. I think they're treading very dangerously along the lines of making revelation knowledge a progressive kind of thing, which again is this problem of historicism that Ed Echeverry and I pointed out in our interview together. Okay, so he goes on after the referencing Nunn's work, and he goes in a little bit into there are different ways to view law than just this idea of a universal law, which again, the idea of this universal law is just a product of European culture. So it's not really universal. And one of the alternatives to the idea of there being an objective universal law, a law in order that is sort of above any given culture, would be to embrace law in context theories. And here he references now, one thing also to point out, Logan, is that, because he does criticize church leaders in the first essay for not understanding or giving only broad generalizations about critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of pointed out, well, okay, doesn't that make sense if the theory itself is all over the place? There's multiple movements, there's incompatible traditions in his own words.
Yeah.
But then also, there's 50 years almost 50 years worth of material to be going through here. And I will say this, any pastor, I'll agree with Nathan on this. Any pastor who thinks that he can just sort of throw out a list of books that his congregation should read, and say, hey, just read these and take a look at the Bible and just make sure you look at them through a biblical worldview. I mean, you are setting your congregation up for failure, right? Yeah. Because there's 50 years of theorizing and scholarly level articles and tons of historical development here that even the pastor with the most time on his hands would not be able to wade through it all, right?
Yeah.
And so many prior philosophical sort of commitments too, that the average person going to church, the average 20-year-old is not going to see through that, is not going to understand
exactly.
The epistemology that stands behind critical and social theories and so on and so forth. So,
yeah. So I guess at this point,
and
just continue.
I say that because in referencing Duncan Kennedy, one of the first thing Kennedy says in this article is he cites Jean-Paul Lyotard, who coined the term postmodernism. And Kennedy says that we need to conceptualize groups in a postmodern way, recognizing their reality in our lives without losing sight of the partial, unstable, contradictory character of the group existence. So he's presupposing doing, looking at race, racism, and everything from a postmodern perspective. Okay. All right. And then, so he goes on about there being this different method of doing law, which is law in context.
Yeah.
Because
now, what page on the, are you still on the Nunn article, or are you back on Nathan's paper?
Page 11, Nathan's paper, where he references Freeman and Kennedy. The lineage here is being that there were critical legal studies first, and then out of the critical legal studies came sort of the critical race theory studies of the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
Now I did say, well, okay, if law in context, again, maybe not something we're going to throw out completely, but I mean, one could think about, again, the problem of, well, who's going to decide, which cultural contexts will allow for different legal conclusions. I mean, there are all kinds of cultural contexts that have different, like if critical theory is correct in that it's just society producing laws, right? It's not the intellect grasping anything transcendent or anything embedded in nature like natural law theory. Here's some examples of different cultural contexts and some laws that were created in those contexts. You could think about like the Indian law of, is it Sutri, which is the
Not entirely sure.
the burning of the widow with the dead husband, genital mutilation in parts of Islamic African contexts, caning in Southeast Asian contexts, honor killings in Islamic Middle Eastern contexts. And then, of course, I won't read it now, but I could read a section on slavery from this book that I have, The Principles of Mohammedan Jurisprudence According to the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanabali schools that I read a long time ago, which will give you some conclusions about slavery, again, in Islamic context that would probably be found very distasteful to most people in the United States today. Those are all different cultural contexts that have come to different legal conclusions on concrete issues. Who's going to decide what, if there's anything normative over any of those contexts and the conclusions they've come to, the legal conclusions they've come to? right? And it's again just a broader sort of issue here that doesn't seem to be solved on critical race theory. If it's just
Yeah.
societies that produce reality and the laws that pertain to the reality they produce.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to backfill a little bit, just on page
Yeah.
9 and 10, before we start moving beyond page 11 of the of his essay, he opens up again, harping on his previous paper, saying a lot of people haven't brought these issues up. And I know then, I guess I can bring up now, is that, Vodi Bakum has been speaking on these issues. I'm not trying to set him up as the, end all, but he is a
Right.
extremely popular
Yeah.
level pastor that has been talking. He does some academic work. And to just say that they've largely been silent when there is an individual who has been very vocal for a very long time on these issues, you have to take him into consideration. And I think there's been a little bit of sweeping him under the rug. Maybe not intentionally. I don't want to say he's been
Right.
intentionally missing people, but there are people who have been speaking on this, and the people we've been interviewing. These are
Yeah.
scholars who have been talking about.
No, I believe his
race
name
issues.
is Andrew Sandlin, who also has been speaking on these things you don't hear much about. I mean, part of the reason why maybe a lot of people also have not been speaking on this, and we brought this out previously, is that, well, we felt like for at least, I think, several decades, that the primary sort of threat to an orthodox Christian worldview was from the natural sciences, was
Yeah.
from sort of a philosophical naturalism. And there is obviously a robust body of work in defense of a traditional Christian worldview against sort of the successors of Bertrand Russell and the logical positivists and the hardcore Darwinian evolutionists. So that work's by and large been done from everybody from like Swinburne to Plantinga to more recently Craig and Proust and Kuhns and so on and so forth, and other apologists and philosophers. But okay, I mean, this is a little bit more recent in that I'd say you really don't get, you get the start of these, and we can go back to Marx, but again, we're saying more in the West. It starts with the Frankfurt School in the 40s and 50s. So sometimes it takes time for the theory itself that may be contradictory to a Christian worldview to develop before it's worth actually sort of attending to, right?
Yeah, and that might be something worth acknowledging. It's not acknowledged in these papers, but as you said, when you're looking or through the scholars, asking what is the controlling problem of the age, and it seemed like with modernism, then postmodernism, there was a push against Christianity in some of these analytic questions. If you go far back enough, epistemological questions, metaphysical questions, where it's like, are there legitimate religious beliefs? Can you even have a religious belief? What are, is there metaphysical realities that is no longer true? And so Christian scholars are responding to these, and it's in part unfair to say, given the modern context, Christians have never been talking about this. Well, go back to William Wilberforce, Christians are talking about race. So you have to sometimes ask, okay, what is the controlling issue now? And then are the scholars now, or is there scholars of another age that are speaking on these issues?
Coleman Hughes, in a recent podcast, February 21st podcast with John Yu, and I think Christopher Rufo is the other gentleman's name, he did point out this as well, that even in the secular academy, the non-Christian academy, or people who are, who are doing scholarly work, but not from a Christian worldview, there hasn't been a lot of pushback on critical race theory since Crenshaw and Bell in the 70s and 80s. And he was asking the question, why? And I believe it was John Yu who said, there's, who referenced like 2 or 3 papers that did provide like a strong critique of critical race theory itself. But, these people, there's a lot of political pressure. I mean, people get attacked if you try and undermine this position. Which again, I think says something about its merits. I mean, when you see a pattern of ad hominem, right? Right there, I think, again, not again, but critical race theory can be so tricky because, if you get to the point of saying where things like even logical fallacies are white constructs, you're almost in a place where, again, then we feel like we're in sort of living in a Nietzschean world again, right?
Yeah.
But
Well, and that's where, I've talked about that in previous podcasts where maybe that's just ironically, the logical conclusion that CRT does grapple with. Once you get rid of fallacies, it's just power dynamics.
Yeah.
And so it's not just a description of the problem, but it also then turns into a prescription for the current problem, which becomes very damaging and scary when power becomes also the solution to the problems of power.
Right, exactly.
But anyways, so that was one thing I want to bring up. The second one was his quote, his definition of CRT is CRT is a movement aimed at providing an anti-racist understanding of the relationship between race and law. Quickly, I think we could just say refer back to our previous episode on his first paper, where I think that's just an insufficient definition if you take into consideration the work that the CRT scholars are doing and the way they view themselves, because they're trafficking in all these ideas about law, all these ideas about universality, questions about dichotomous reasoning, questions about whether moral truths and those things are culturally emergent. I just think it's an insufficient definition, or the definition presupposes a lot that's not inherent, prima facie evident in the definition.
So he goes on to talk about, it's a very short section here, critical race theory and Kriegel, where he shows some disagreement between critical legal studies, which he says gave rise to critical theory, and where critical race theorists rejected some of the conclusions by critical legal studies theorists. Anything there? He says further, all CRT scholars found CLS's disregard of racism and white supremacy indefensible. So again, and we heard this in his panel discussion, that if there's one thing, though, that everybody in any critical race theory, if we can call it a discipline, agrees on, is that it is white supremacy that acts as the standard for anything else being called racist, right? And white supremacy, again, defined, as we just kind of pointed out, in Nunn's work, Nunn, not Noon. And
you switched to my view.
Other panelists, it's your power. You have some kind of power over me. White supremacy here are these abstract concepts. It's not white. It's not white people like you and me, or people who look white or appear white, who have some sort of false belief that they are biologically superior to non-whites, right? Let's call it a simple racism or common sense racism. Not that racism is common sense. I don't want to name it that, but we need another term for just simple racism, which would be the belief that there is an essential difference between the races. It's something biological, or it's a capacity, and that I, in virtue of being white-skinned, am somehow superior to anybody who's got a darker shade of color than me or something. And that's clearly what those pigmentocracies were based on originally. They were based on what people thought were an essential feature, not a social construct, because social construct theory doesn't come along until the 19th century, right? Yeah. Which is maybe another problem here, because we're looking back at these pigmentocracies that were created by the Portuguese in the 15th century, but now we're talking in social construct theoretical terms, where they really meant something biological, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, and that's usually where it seemed like it emerged. At least, because they go in the definition, what is race is biological. I don't think you see cellular biology or genetics guiding this Pennsylvania legislative bodies in the 1700s or the Portuguese, what you see is that guy looks different.
Yeah.
And it seems like there are clusters of differences that we can see. These are very, I want to say, they're very simplistic views of race. It's not. So some of the arguments I would say is fine as far as the biology and saying there's no biological difference, so on and so forth. That's fine. I don't think until about the 1940s, 1930s is when you start seeing eugenics asking these questions in a way and then trying to manipulate the genetics pool to create certain kinds of peoples with certain kinds of traits. Again, I think those have been by and large dismissed as bad. There's some people in the academy that still hold on to some of those kinds of views. But I think
he calls it, I think, essentially, or one of the articles calls it sort of essentialism or biological. There's something essential about that makes people or puts people into different actual racial categories, right? That you could then scientifically sort of identify what it is.
Yeah, and I think the argument that CRT theorists tend to provide that race is a social construct, I think is a fair argument. I think also it's a fair argument, at least the problem is the distinction between visible, explicit forms of racism and then this sort of implied. But I don't see CRT theorists, or I haven't read any CRT theorists who provide a way of being able to evaluate someone's intentions in any way that could be connected to objective framework. So like, how do you know if someone's intending to be racist by their actions? You go, well, usually you could, and this is what some of the CRT advocates would say was the classical racism, is that you could just measure the actions. Oh, it seems like he's attacking just these people, or he says, I don't like these people based on their skin color. You go, okay, that's racist. But it's the measuring of intents, which I could see people having problems with, because we know this all the time where people will do things sort of what seems to be fair, but have kind of insidious intentions.
Right.
But I don't see if there's any legal apparatus in which you can get people for their private intentions. And that could be an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah. Although I suppose that the entire range of diversity training and social justice training and re-education that we see not just at the universities, but also now in any of the commercial sectors in our society, I suppose the idea is they are geared at changing the internal dispositions and attitudes of people so that nobody has the thought of being superior than the other person based on my race, because I think most people do take race to be a biological category, right? The average person is not thinking in terms of reality being a social construct.
No.
So,
but this goes, I'm reading through Michelle Alexander's work, and this is the same thing. This is where, she basically says, well, we can't solve the racial problem through regulating explicit racism. What we have to do is re-engineer the mindset, basically. It's like, well, at what point is this just not the French Revolution in the modern age?
2.0.
Yeah, it's just as long as we can reimagine the human self and reconstruct it, then all our problems go away.
Could be a little bit more of a bloodless. We might not need guillotines if we have, gifts and stuff. Is the gift the memes? Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Gifts.
Maybe. On page. Go ahead.
There was another point I wanted to make though about whether or not this whole project is seriously question begging though. And I'm just trying to formulate this to say like, well, we now believe in our enlightened era or post-enlightened era, I guess I should say, that, or we know that because we produce knowledge, that race is a social construct Those in the 15th century who were creating pigmentocracies would not have thought of race as a social construct. They would have thought, like you said, just some simple basic features of objective reality. That person just looks different than me. It's a biological thing, whatever. Okay.
And there were questions about mental capacity, but they
Right.
weren't able to be measured in any.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
on average, it seems like.
I'm assuming that simple theory, and I don't know, maybe you'd have to read somebody like maybe Jared Diamond or something who has written on this. I don't know. From a purely materialistic perspective, that, you know, Europeans, as they sailed out and they saw people with darker skin, but it seemed like they had less technology. Right.
Yeah, well, this goes all the way back to
right.
Rome's times, where you have
right.
the Northern Wars and Athens with its.
Yeah.
Goes back a long
way. But you know, if we're saying that it's a social construct, that race is a social construct, but we're saying it's not. So it's not based on biology or some other thing like a spiritual or mental essence, right? You know, it seems like we're in that gray area of like, are we making a self-defeating statement by saying it's a social construct and then making the truth claim that race is not biological and not essential? Now those things can no longer be investigated to see whether or not race maybe is essential or is biological, because we've just defined race willy-nilly to be a social construct.
Yeah, and that would be an interesting conversation to have, because yes, they want to say race isn't an essential feature of a human person. I think we can all agree with that. But then they want to then turn around and go, okay, but it's a social contract, and that social contract is very important.
I mean,
what does that mean to be very important? It's, it defines a person's lived experience. Well, that doesn't help, because now you're kind of going back into the metaphysics.
Well, let me just think this through. If I say race is a social construct,
mm-hmm.
and I can say that in the 21st century, but nobody would have said that in the 15th century. So I'm saying in the 21st century, race is a social construct. Why can I say that race is a social construct? It's in virtue of the society I'm living in, which has constructed a society in which I can say it is true that race is a social construct. It seems like maybe there's even sort of a regress here, where, okay, if 50 years from now, our society says that race is determined by biology, then that's got to be true in virtue of just America in 71 says
mm-hmm.
that race is a biological, essentially biological, right?
Yeah. Well, and this is why I think Hayek's critique of social institutions is, I think, a legitimate critique, where he says, well, when you talk about social, there's no referent. Now, you can talk about institutions that have influence, and then you can map that influence, that, that organization is publishing this material, who's being read by those people who are then affecting those policies. But to say it's a social institution as it's an organ of society, it's a feature of some bigger unit, Hayek can go point to it.
Right. I mean, and look, it is tricky because John Searle wrote in, I think it's a 1994 book called The Construction of Social Reality. It's on the other side of my desk over there. There are things that, there are like realities that society creates, like money, right? Money is not, it's not like a natural fact, right?
No.
Marriages, football games, he lists all these things and he goes into detail of like his formula is X acts as Y in context C. There's all kinds of things that we just sort of ascribe, features and things to, but it's not like they're to be found anywhere in nature or in some kind of metaphysical ontological.
Yeah. There are things that are pegged to the human person,
Right.
But like things that with money, for example, like this goes, a lot of these Austrian economists would look at the kind of the endeavor to find the essential value of things.
Right.
And they weren't able to find the essential value. And now if you say, well, there's just like inherent social value, well, that seems also not to be entirely correct because it fluctuates given supply and demand and perceived value. But the question is, who are the perceivers? It doesn't seem like it's society as a whole. It's all the individuals.
I mean, it does kind of raise the question of whether or not we should biblically maybe not see race as essential. And then if it is in some way essential as, I don't know, part of God's design plan for the world, then maybe that would allow us to put it in a biblical context, a teleological context even, than just saying it's purely a social construct. You know, like it is part of God's design plan that there are different races. And of course, maybe in virtue of sin, these races sort of are in conflict, but, you know, a redeemed version of would be to see, again, this kind of, diversity as part of God's plan, but it's supposed to come together under something unifying, like, the power and presence of God.
Being image bearers and so on and so forth.
I mean, I do recall Wolfhart Pannenberg in one of his books, I think it was called, The Historicity of Reality, or The Reality of History. I'll have to find it. But, he talks about Adam naming the animals and why that's in the Bible. He finds that passage strange. Something about when Adam is speaking about, these external objects, these other living beings, animals, that when he's naming them, he's pointing and referring, kind of like, as Kripke talks about in Naming a Necessity, sort of baptizing them as the thing, that there's something true about what he's saying about the essence of those animals.
Yeah.
That we actually are, when we speak about the external world, saying something true about it. The problem of the noetic effects of sin, though, is we're also either we're not able to describe exhaustively reality, so that there are lacunas, there are gaps in how we describe reality, or there might just be falsehoods mingled in with how we describe reality because of, again, the noetic effects of sin, but that we were meant to be able to describe things and speak of things accurately. As they are in themselves. So there might be some kind of middling view here. We're getting a little bit off onto the metaphysics of this.
I think if anything, it shows that there is a conversation to be had, which is how do you conceptualize different social constructivists and just kind of this.
What's the term? Simple realism, right?
Yeah.
And a simple realism.
But that's that conversation you're not seeing in this paper.
Not at all.
So this is kind of like something maybe the listeners could think, oh, here's a potential that could take place.
Potential alternative to go to. Okay, so he goes on. Next subsection is critical race theory on law, page 12, and he talks a little bit more about Derek Bell's work, which John McWhorter has sort of, I believe, in one of his or more of his episodes, talked about Derek Bell's work. Might have to look that up. And then he mentions here some historians who have sort of documented the establishment of pigmentocracies over the ages. Again, which we're not denying that these pigmentocracies existed, and we're not denying simple racism in any way, shape, or form. We're just questioning whether or not CRT has any value as a way to redress the evils of simple racism.
Yeah. In this section, I want to, unless you want to take a jab at it first.
Yeah.
His reference to, in the article, this may have been his editing or maybe the magazine's editing. It's Alexis, not Alex. Alexis de Tocqueville is Democracy in America, and his reference of John Locke, I think, are overly simplistic. I also think he's not very clear on where he's citing them. I had to look through this, so I guess before I begin, Tony, is there something that you would like to refer to this section before I jump into this Locke and
Yeah,
Tocqueville
I'll point out
citations?
something about his use of the analogy of Plato's cave real quick,
Okay.
because I think you're going to bring up a good point there that maybe we hope he's going to, in his book length treatment of this topic, maybe he'll do more, he'll do, I don't want to say a better job. I'm sure he will. He's an assistant professor. He's going to do a better job in that treatment with footnoting and citations and stuff. This was obviously, again, we do want to point out this is just a series of essays that Dr. Cartagena wrote, not the actual book itself.
Yeah.
But I do struggle with this. He uses the metaphor. He kind of comes up with his own idea of Plato's cave, which I found interesting. It says, within this hegemony, referring back to the pigmentocracies, the creation of these racial hierarchies in the 15th and 16th century that were exported through colonialism. And that, again, as we just pointed out, we're probably based on what some people thought were essential features, like biological features or maybe spiritual features. It says, within this hegemony, parentheses, this racialized, or M dash, this racialized Platonic cave, M dash, racist beams cast light upon European and European-derived societies, offering the false impression that they are legitimate and superior to their non-white counterparts residing in unenlightened, uncivilized shadows. So I took that to mean that, the racist beams, I guess, are from the candle or the fire, right? That would be behind the people who are looking at the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now,
so, and
he's pulling from none here. The European Drive Society. Oh, yeah. The language is coming from, it seems like, from none. That's a point that he makes. But
so again, the fire or the candlelight, as we know the parable of Plato's cave. So what the enchained sort of non-white minority has to do, right, is break free from their chains, look behind them, see that it's a candle and the cardboard cutouts going by, and then they got to go up into the sunlight so they can see, I guess for Nathan, the true gospel. At this point, I might even say, he is a Christian. They have to see the true gospel untainted by the whiteness, which is the candlelight and the cardboard cutouts. So I think that's what he's trying to get at.
Yes, which would be, again, this is where when we started asking if he's trying to Christianize or have some sort of Christian elements into it, the question is, because it doesn't seem like it's in CRT, this objective view of law, objective view of morality seems to not be within CRT. So maybe he's saying that there is...
Right, that would be the hope, because,
yes.
I notice he uses Plato's cave. So if we're talking Plato, we're talking objective, for the forms for Plato.
Yes.
Real reality, however you want to call it. So it seems to be like this is the first inkling we get.
There's hierarchies, there's dichotomous reasoning, abstraction with Plato is almost part and parcel of the forms.
Well, and that's another problem where again, we are hoping or assuming he's going to try and he's going to try and introduce some kind of Christian metaphysics into this, right? Yeah. He's got to, otherwise, again.
Otherwise, this is kind of a culturally derived expression. And the question is, okay, where are you getting out of the cave to what? Another culture?
Exactly. A different candle.
Yeah. And maybe it's the sun, but the sun is now just replacing the candle in the cave. And the illusion just gets larger and larger.
Right.
Until.
Right. And then there's a second.
But then now there's hierarchies.
Yeah.
But now there's hierarchies in which there's some that are better. It would probably be better to be outside the sun than it is in the cave, right? It's very peculiar.
So, okay, I hope this is going to get through to whatever small audience we have watch this, that if he doesn't imbue that or inject some metaphysic and some epistemology into this, even if the racialized minority breaks out of his chains and can get past whiteness, he's just going to be dealing with some other societal construct.
Yeah.
At that point, he's still not anywhere near reality or truth.
Yeah. And without hierarchies, you can't really say if it was better or worse.
And without hierarchies, you can't make it. Yeah, you can't make any normative claim as to whether or not the next candle over in the cave behind that white candle, you come to a brown candle. Is that going to be better, worse? You can't talk about in normative terms. It's just different, right? Okay, so now you take up this historical claim that he makes.
Yeah, so he talks about, he writes, John Locke's arguments for indigenous dispossession in his second treatise on government are representative here. And then he moves on. There's a few things. The first is that he's not explicitly talking about indigenous dispossession. Now, that might be in the background because given the time period he's writing, who he's writing to, you can find that in the preface. Given his positions in government and different institutions, that might be in the back of his mind, but it's not explicit. But he referenced the entire corpus. This is something I had problems with both his references. Is it's just, here's the book, which ends up being 400 or 500 pages or whatever. So I looked through. It seems like there's a couple sections he could be referring to. One of them is Locke's view of property, private property, in which he argues that property becomes owned by an individual through labor, right? If you go out in the woods and pick some apples or some oranges, or you hunt and kill a deer, that land doesn't become yours. You haven't really done anything to it that nature hasn't provided. Now, if you went and maybe you tended a vineyard, you planted a bunch of trees, or whatever, weeded the yard and watch go. Now it becomes yours. This is kind of his assumption of how private property became property and how it's just. And sometimes they'll read that section and go, there's his view of private property. We want to connect that to what he calls the doctrine of discovery. Generally speaking, the doctrine of discovery. He harps on that, so I'm thinking he's referring to chapter 5 of the second treatise. But the common response, the common critique of this is, okay, but you can't just read chapter 5 of this entire book and go, well, there's his view of property, and that's just how he's going to justify dispossession of indigenous populations, saying, okay, they never had private property. No, he goes on in chapter, I think it's 16 of Conquest, it's sections 175 through 196, where he talks about the opposing side, which is you can't by force take someone else's stuff or take control of their citizens or claim land through power. And he talks about this might not be what most people would think is common sense, but if governments arise from the consent of the governed, and if there's some sense in which things can be owned, governments have to operate within certain moral and judicial confines of some sense. And one of them is you have to have just and unjust wars. There's another section where he talks about slavery. This goes back into a question about the death penalty, on those sorts of things, where he thinks that if you commit a serious enough crime against another individual which warrants the death penalty, the justification is you forfeited your life, right? If you committed an egregious enough offense, in which case slavery can be a way out of the consequence to the individual you committed the crime to. So if you murdered someone, maybe someone's wife or children, and it was a death penalty, he says it seems like maybe there's a way out, in which case you just become that person's slave. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the slave owner in that sense would be still under the laws of the land, in which you couldn't just kill the person necessarily. So I think, so first of all, he just kind of says, it makes it look like how he quotes Locke seems to imply that Locke is just talking about, here's how we take people's land, especially the indigenous populations, which is not the case. This is natural law, just war theory discussion, and it could be applied. The second thing was Tocqueville. I would highly recommend, again, I don't know where in Democracy in America he's referring to. It's not explicit. The section I think he's talking about is towards the end. I think it's chapter 18 or 16 or chapter 9. I'm not sure. Towards the end of the first part of the book, where he's describing his observation of America on the Europeans, the Native Americans, and then the black slaves. It's like, I think the section is entitled something like On the Three Races in Their Prospective Future or something like that. It's just very insightful. Read the section on Native Americans it's very insightful because he does this observation where he's like, okay, what's going on with the Native Americans? What are some goods? What are some bads? What's going on with the Americans? What are some goods? What are some bads? And then what do I think the future is? Some things he brings up is that the Native Americans are unable to agree with each other. They've kind of fallen in love with their own mythic origin. They want the benefits of Western civilization, but they don't want to civilize themselves. He talks about some of the atrocities, like the idea of being dispossessed of their land, which results from a conflict between the state governments and the federal governments at this time, where he's saying the federal government's making promises that they can't enforce on the states, and the states are no longer interested in keeping those promises. There's an incentive where he talks about how these governors can purchase land, massive plots of land that rulers of countries back in Europe could never imagine buying. And so then there's incentive there. He says there's this weird, unfortunate situation where the Native Americans are having their animals driven out. Right? They're hunting for the fur and then giving it to the Europeans for trade. And as they move west, they're running into tribes who are not interested in accommodating the Native Americans. They end up going to war. So you have famine on the one side and war on the other. So it's a good reflection where he sees the immense complexity of the situation. He gives fault where I think fault's due, on the American side, on the Native American side, on the European side. And he ends with an interesting note that basically he thinks in the mixed situation is that America has successfully, I think he uses the words decimated the Native American population through no bloodshed and no transgression of human moral law. Now, whether that's true or not, it does, I think, illustrate the complexities of the situation where you have the intersection of law in Native American lands,
Right.
Native American, I mean, he even goes into like the morals, the values of the Native Americans, that they don't value things like agriculture or labor. They value things like hunting and war.
And that would probably be primarily referring to the tribes that were in North America, because
Yes.
the Mesoamerican and South American cultures were very different.
Yeah, no, Democracy in America, it's entirely just his observations.
Yeah.
And he talks about seeing what would become the beginning of the Trail of Tears, where he's like, it's absolutely horrible
Right.
what happened, that they're, watching the Native Americans essentially give up and knowing that they had lost.
This is sort of just Margaret Mead wrote years ago a book called, I think, Coming to Age, and was it in Samoa? Coming of Age in Samoa, I think, was the name of her book. And I haven't read this book. I'm just aware of Margaret Mead's work. And I believe, if I'm correct, I might be wrong in this, but, her view was that of sort of the myth of the noble savage, that, and I know using the word savage is inappropriate in our day and age, but, and I obviously don't believe that people were savages in the sense of, again, somehow, innately inferior. That, again, would go against every biblical doctrine that I ascribe to. But it is just, this sense of, that myth has been dispelled. We wouldn't want, as Christians doing history, we wouldn't want to whitewash the history of missions and missionary work, that it wasn't tainted with grave evils. But I think one of the fallacies we're just falling into over and over again, and probably began because we're living in this sort of Nietzschean world, but then we become willing to whitewash other histories. And, we get into this game of trying to create sort of sinless classes of people. And, I think it's just a bad practice as a Christian we're always supposed to be truth oriented, that we wouldn't want to whitewash the history of the missionaries and what they did wrong, and even some did great evil. But there's no point in whitewashing the history of the Native Americans as well.
Yeah.
As if they were living in perfect harmony in, the Garden of Earthly Paradise or something.
Yeah.
Right? It's just not true. If there's one thing that I think we have to lock arm in arms on with anybody who's going to claim Christianity is something like the doctrine of original sin.
Yeah.
And you tend to get a sense, at least, not that it's said explicitly, that, if we push the critical race theory lens and the concept of white supremacy too far, you're almost getting into sort of a Rene Girardian kind of thing where, white culture is going to become the new sacrificial lamb for all of society and culture, all of societal and cultural ills upon which we can heap our guilt and our shame and sort of sacrifice, at the altar.
Yeah.
And I just want to, I'm not saying that Nathan's doing that, but when you've pointed this out several times now, there's sort of a simplistic retelling of history here. And I don't think we should do that either way. We don't want the simplistic telling of manifest destiny or something like that on the one hand, but nor do we want the simplistic retelling, like some kind of hagiographical account of what indigenous life was like, or what life in Africa was like before the Portuguese came down there to trade with other Africans who were selling whoever they had conquered in tribal warfare to be transported over to the New World.
Yeah. And what's important, and I think it's not just, I think some people could listen to this and say, oh, you're just trying to defend colonial America at this time. Right. I think though what's important is that if you're not willing to look at the situation as complex, you actually miss what's unfortunate about the situation. You actually you can't even see the tragedy of the situation. And that's where I would again recommend reading Tocqueville's Observation, because he at least points out the tragedy. He looks at Rome being sacked, or he looks at the Mongolian Empire attacking China. And he said, it seems like in history where you see assimilation that seems fair, it's when you have one society that has the power and the other society has the intellect. You can see Rome with Athens, where they take over and then they marvel at their technology and they assimilate. And he said, what's so unfortunate about the Native American situation is that they don't have the tech and they also don't have the power. And so then they're just going back and forth between, and this is what he says, war on the one side and famine on the other. And I think what's the tragedy is the question that emerges, okay, then what could have been done? And it's not saying, it's not giving an excuse. It gives us the future of, okay, how do you help people? Or how do you,
and that's I think you don't want to discount. And this is where, you start getting worried, even when you hear people like Pope Francis himself, not that we're Roman Catholics, but almost saying things that make it sound like the history of Catholic or Protestant missionary work was, over, from Europe migrating outward was never should have happened. Like the gospel should not have been propagated at all. Which of course is very anachronistic thinking, because you're doing it after 500 years of history and you're seeing the warts in all of history and everything that was done wrong. And it's very easy to cast stones. But it's like you do have to also find, or take into account that in spite of the real atrocities that, and again, this is where I worry that we're just living in such to reference Charles Taylor again and make that point about even that Nunn made about desacralization, that we're living in these disenchanted times where we really don't think that the eternal salvation of people's souls was worth it. Mm-hmm. Because we might not really believe that there is an eternal salvation to people's souls.
Yeah.
We're really just worried about the fact that bodies were harmed and psyches were harmed.
Yeah.
Today, then and now. And because that's all we really care about, because we're not really interested, or we don't seriously believe anymore that there are spiritual goods beyond our human flourishing down here. St. Francis of Assisi just doesn't make sense to us anymore. Why would anybody do that, right? Another way that Taylor puts it, like how we look at a Francis of Assisi will tell us a lot about our own faith. So we look back at history and all we're seeing is that people's material conditions, their culture was drastically altered, which is bad, could be bad. But again, it also raises the question of whether or not their culture, if Christianity is true, maybe the parts of their culture needed to be significantly altered, like at least in Central and South America, the human sacrifice part, which you talked about earlier before we started.
Well, and that's, I think, a question, and maybe this is just something that falls out of critical race theory.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if you can have that conversation of, are there cultures, again, every culture is going to have its defect, but the question is, are there certain beliefs by certain individuals that tend to just be better? I think cultures who don't prioritize human sacrifice within the religious system tend to be better than those who do. But I don't know if CRT can say that. Like maybe if they say, well, the people doing the human sacrifice are oppressing those who are not, but now you're getting, again, it seems like a universal law, which says that in every situation, in every culture, but it doesn't seem like that's part of the theory, though. That seems like you're going to have to manipulate, and maybe that's the hope in when
we seem to have a theory that just really not just opens the door, but that almost promotes cultural relativism.
Yeah, right? through like law. Yeah.
So he goes on to end this section listing several patterns of racialized discrimination in the 19th and 20th century by white supremacist hegemony. And he gives some political and legal acts that were, put into place. The Treaty of Hidalgo, the Page Act, Chinese exclusion, and so on and so forth. And of course, one would want to look at each of those particular cases and,
Yeah. And again, I think I didn't have the opportunity to look at each of these cases. I did look up two of them, the ones that he significantly refers to later.
Mm-hmm.
But in my notes, I just had said he's gonna have to pick out like the aspects he thinks are racist. He's gonna have to say why he thinks they're racist, and then connect it to the CRT interpretation of the situation and why CRT would deem it racist. Because you're gonna have to do some work on defining what is racist. I mean, already, like, he's already pointing out all these problems, and you have to remember he's pointing out all these problems without a definition of racism, or at least a racism that is accepted by, I guess, a majority part of the CRT scholars. So there's this kind of, cloud in the sky kind of thing, and a cloud in the sky, castle in the sky kind of situation, where the definition of racism, which is the important word operating within this paper, is not defined in a way that has a consensus or maybe a majority consensus, I guess, at minimum.
This is a problem that Jacob has been harping on in our podcast, and that I believe this John Yu mentioned in his February 21st podcast with Coleman Hughes, of seeing, everything through the lens of one feature, where everything else as a potential factor for why that law was passed just drops out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He goes on. The next section is critical race theory on race. So, okay, maybe we'll get a little more clarity here about what race is being socially constructed as today. And so he says Harris's treatment, and this is Cheryl Harris, one of the scholars that he cites, treatment of whiteness hints at the consensus CRT. He says there's a consensus CRT view of race. Now, we pointed out at the beginning of this recording, that's the consensus right now, but we didn't know what the criteria would be for people to come together to form that consensus. If it's purely a social construct. But he says race most properly refers to a law-shaped social construct, i.e. a human invention. There it is, very clearly put. The human invention, race is a human invention involving historically contingent social systems of meaning that attach to elements of morphology and ancestry. In this view, and I believe this is Harris he's quoting, human interaction, rather than natural differentiation, is the source and continued basis for racial categorization, and much of this interaction happens through law. So human interaction is the source of racism. Not any natural distinctions like your skin color. Well, which is really I don't even know where to begin with that statement. It's basically like people treat each other badly. That's racism. If I take it at face value, I can't believe that that's actually what she's saying here. That people treating each other badly is racist.
Well, I think this is where you could say, and maybe I'm extrapolating too much. I think it's this kind of definition which you could say, well, that's why European culture is racist, because you could say it's culturally conditioned to a particular setting, and that particular setting is just expanding through European countries or European derived societies.
You know, it seems to me if we push this too far, what we're going to get is whatever social group winds up in a position of authority, they just become racist. It's sort of an emergent property. As soon as you can sort of identify a social group as being in control, which would tell me that the next group that would be rightly called racist would be the Chinese, the way things are going, or maybe India, but probably China.
Mm-hmm.
Also, again, in light of some of the things that Jacob has said and just some of the things that I've been reading, not to mention those bilateral talks that occurred up in Alaska, where our diplomats were just getting, I mean, it was like a lion playing with a puppy dog. Mm-hmm. If you saw the Chinese diplomats sort of just hammering away at our guys, so to say, who were both white males, by the way, the ones that I saw. But, you'd say like, well, China, if they emerge as the dominant culture, then they take on the property of being racist. Like it would be Asian supremacy then, or yellow supremacy, I suppose. What that at least seems possible on this view.
Well, it's not. I don't think the definition at this point is trying to define what racism is. He's just saying that race. Well, race isn't defined. Okay. So I think because there's a few things coming to mind. This is where you get people like D'Angelo and others saying that whiteness is intellectual. So you get Nunn saying white supremacy or whiteness is included. They're all ideas. But obviously, so here's the question then. How do you connect pigmentocracies to ideas that are not based off of natural differences of any kind? And it seems like they're trying to do a both-and analysis, but then make maybe no legitimate connection between the two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because then the color of people's skin would be a natural difference. I don't know how you could say race is categorized not based off of physical differences or natural differences. I'm not saying that they're essential, just saying like as a concept. And then say, but they construct pigmentocracy. Are these just accidental connections that abstracting or dichotomous reasoning tends to just put white people at the top. So does pigmentocracy become an accident of certain ideas or concepts? I don't know. It's just not clear. So I think that's...
So I'd have to dig in more to this quote by Cheryl Harris. I think it's Harris who's saying that historically contingent social systems of meaning that attach to elements of morphology, that must be biological, facial features, pigmentation, and ancestry. And then she goes on to say, in this human interaction, rather than natural differentiation is the source and continued basis for racial. So if that statement alone says human interaction is the source and continued basis for racial categorization, how people interact is the source of the categories of race that societies come up with.
Yeah.
That seems to be putting the cart in front of the horse. To me, it seems to me like that would be different saying people recognize natural differences and they interact differently because of those natural differences. Right.
Yeah.
And that would be the source of, because it's just saying racial categorization. If you say that the interaction comes first, well, what she might be saying is when you start interacting with somebody from a different geographical area, you start noticing cultural differences. And when you start noting cultural differences, like people have different foods or they have different music, they'd have different things like different religions, then that's the source of racial categorization. Now that would make more sense. I could see that, I suppose.
Yeah, and that would at least seems to be a description of how race begins. Now then the question becomes this law-shaped social construct or human invention. Goes back into the question of, the topic that we were dealing with on None.
Yeah.
About all that could imply.
So Nathan goes on to say this is a consensus but not a unanimous view. This idea of human interactions being the source and continued basis for racial categorization. Mm-hmm. So again, it's just a consensus view. It could change, I suppose, as time goes on, as society changes. And
then as he continues, I wonder how much of this, because then he says, he quotes Tommy Curry about race as a colonial category. It seems like that would be a violation of the previous definition of race. Now, again, he's going to say there's no agreement on race, but then he seems to be using competing definitions to make different points that seem to be furthering one particular conclusion, which I'm not entirely sure if that's fair.
Well, there's two, and this paragraph where he quotes Curry, race is a colonial category, which would then say that it seems to me then it was Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands who were the nations or the people groups that developed the idea that of race. I don't know. That's one where you'd have to do some more ethno.
Well, I mean, it seems like there are racial. I mean, he quotes a couple of Supreme Court cases. One of them at which he refers to the racial segregation in India. Yeah. So it seems like the racial segregation or the idea of racial superiority isn't inherent to colonialism, unless he's willing to say that India is a derived Western. I guess maybe that's what maybe that's their fallback is anytime you see some sort of
I have a
Because
strong.
is it based in Hinduism? The claim is it was based in Hinduism, which is not a Western.
I have a strong sense that if we look into any ancient culture, well, not even ancient. I mean, you just go back maybe 1,000 years, you're going to find pigmentocracies.
Yeah.
That's my side. I don't have the evidence. I mean, I did find a news.
I mean, some of these are naturally occurring. I guess if you live in certain regions and you stay in certain regions, then you don't see a naturally. I mean, maybe there's, I don't.
You might be able to make the claim that the European colonial powers were just the most successful at implementing a pigmentocracy. Like that might be a claim that is defensible. I don't know. In virtue
but what I'm saying is, it seems like the pigmentocracy, according to the original definition of the section, would seem to imply that you're not going to get a pigmentocracy until you see pigmentation.
Yeah, you'd need to have interactions with people who.
So that's where you see a lot of these seafaring, a lot of these seafaring powers that could travel great distances,
right,
would then be able to. But to say it would be interesting to see how CRT would handle like the Hindu culture on its caste system, because it seems hard to justify a pigmentocracy in a society that is by and large of the same color within Europe, until there's the advent of mass transportation. Because it seems like skin color is a result of certain environmental conditions and living in certain situations. It seems like in large part.
Right. Well, I think Jake would probably
determinative.
tell that the caste system. It would be interesting to find out if the caste system did take into account morphology and ancestry, as Harris mentions earlier, which I'm sure took into account ancestry and probably morphology as well. The different facial features of different people from different parts of India, of the continent, of the subcontinent. So again, those seem pretty universal, not just a European construct, but a universal construct.
Yeah.
All right, let's press on.
And then press on. And I mean, I think the last major thing I wanted to say, and then we could talk about whatever you want as far as the rest of this essay. He talks about, I think it's Azawa versus the United States.
Right.
And then he talks about maybe United States versus, is it Thin?
Yeah, Thin.
He basically says, well, the Supreme Court just contradicted itself within a span of a few months. This is why I hate going through SCOTUS cases. They're I mean, if you want to talk about analytic reasoning, at its in some cases just at its max. And if you carefully read through both of those Supreme Court cases, we'll link those in. It's on Cornell Law or something. They're actually very clear to make sure that they're not being contradictory in its relation to how they define white persons. And so there's this question about the 1906 Naturalization Act, how it's being implemented, and the common usage of that law. So part of this, where he says that the SCOTUS made it the law of the land, is just a popular misnomer that the Supreme Courts are crafting law. That's a congressional power. They make the law, and then the Supreme Court's going to try to figure out how to interpret it. They have interpretive powers. And when you read the case, they're very clear to say, well, we have the original intent, and they do argue against, because he uses this idea of the contradiction of Caucasian. They're very clear. Now, this is, of course, besides the fact of whether you agree with the Naturalization Act or how the Supreme Court ruled. This is just the analytic kind of steps that the Supreme Court makes. Mm-hmm. They say you have these prior acts in which Congress, there's a progression here, and they use the term white person. It doesn't seem like white person and Caucasian, though they're used synonymously, they are identical words. So you have one very, very subtle distinction. And then they want to say that it was expanded to include Africans or those of African descent. Mm-hmm. They have the conversation about, was the intent to exclude certain people? Was it not? They said, well, we don't know. Perhaps there was. All we can look at is what the law says and what's the common usage of these words. To Azawa, he wants to claim not that the law was improperly written, but that people of Japanese descent, specifically those born in Japan, fall under white persons. They say that doesn't seem like to be the common usage, and they close that case. They go with Finn versus United States, where he wants to say that the high caste in the Hindu culture, because of his exclusionary caste system, they don't intermarry with lower castes, and because it has, through an Aryan connection, a Proto-Indian European descent, he is classified as a white person. And the Supreme Court says, well, it seems like the Aryan is a linguistic definition, not a biological. And they quote some people that they refer to. And they want to say that they fall back onto the common usage. And they think that, he said, based upon the law, they want to say it seems like it's, they quote, the flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone interpretation for white person is not necessarily pigment, but direct ancestral relation of Western Europeans, which is an interesting push away from the racial segregation that Nathan's pushing. But in any case, I just want to point out what he says. It's obvious a contradiction. Well, if you read through the court case, the Supreme Court's very clear to say, no, there seems to be debate on the Caucasian. What is a Caucasian? They say it's very unhelpful. They say that it is sort of a socially constructed word that really has no substantive meaning.
Right.
And they always fall back onto what is a white person. And when they do say they're synonymous, they try to say, well, it seems like it has a broad category that in the future we're going to have to define what actually makes a Caucasian, but that's not the case here. So we're just going to say common usage, which they do uphold in both cases. So again, you could say that this was an incorrect court case as far as deciding who can immigrate or who can become a naturalized citizen in the United States. I think that debate could be very well. I don't think you should exclude someone from immigrating based on race, but I do think it's very different to call them contradictory. I don't think they were being contradictory. It doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, it seems like the Supreme Court is aware,
right, that
there's some looseness with the term Caucasian that they don't want to use. They don't want to be, I think they call it unscientific, is the unscientific and having no biological connection. It's just a term that's kind of come to be used.
So I believe it's the last section here. Yeah. Critical race theory on jettisoning race. And I would agree here. We talked that, yeah, I mean, race is socially real. I think, we touched upon the idea of there are social facts that don't necessarily, like money or football games or marriage. These are some of the examples that John Searle gives in his book. Even though they're not physically real. I mean, they don't have like a physical, it's not like a brute fact or something, like an electron. And, he goes and he references Crenshaw and others as championing anti-essentialism, saying that, again, race is not biologically real. It plays no role in lived experience and is unworthy of study. Race shapes people's lives. He says, everyone in the U.S. has a racialized experience, even if they do not recognize it. And I kind of latched on to that statement, that truth claim, because I think what's implied here is that it is white people or people of European ancestry who are the ones failing to recognize their racialized experiences, right? That's sort of the whole premise behind D'Angelo's book, right? And it just sort of leaks out when you get angry if you're accused of being white supremacist on the alternative view of white supremacism, and then white people get angry, or if you're accused of white privilege, you get angry. That's sort of like your subconscious racialized experience as a white person, sort of, I guess, coming out, right?
Yeah.
Once you've been sort of poked or provoked.
Yeah, well, I think so. This is where I think it's hard to understand how the critical race theory is operating here.
Yeah.
With this sort of anti-essentialism versus vulgar anti-essentialism, which he's attributing to Crenshaw. So in the one sense, I want to say that race is not biologically real, fair. On the other end, they want to say that they want to also deny that it plays no role in lived experiences and unworthy of study. So now you have a value judgment and then I guess a metaphysical judgment. So the question then is, if it's not biological, is it, I don't know, psychological? It's spiritual? I don't know how you connect lived experience if you're going to deny its biological nature. Unless you get spiritual, I don't know.
Well, right. I mean, I don't think any modernist would appreciate that claim that somehow we can have experiences that aren't just brain states, right?
Yeah.
Which is clearly biological. So, I mean, this is where it gets really problematic again, and you sort of want to take an analytical pickaxe to some of these claims and say, like, I mean, it's just
asking, what do you mean by that? Like, race shapes people's lives. In what way?
Yeah.
They lived experience.
An unrecognized racialized experience. What does that mean?
Well, what makes something, now you could say, based upon the color of their skin, they're treated differently. Maybe that's what you can get, but that's pegged to what though?
Right.
Seems like those are physical features. That's how they're being identified, it would seem like. Pigmentocracy. So it seems, I don't understand how you can get, well, first, I don't understand how you can get this idea that it's not biological in any shape or form, but that it shapes your experiences. But it seems like people are being identified by differences in physical features. You have to resolve those three.
Right.
And then second of all, I don't think people are saying race is unimportant and not worthy of study. I think what they're saying is it's not essential. So when you ask questions of justice, why are you making race essential? I think is the debate.
You know, and I think, Logan, what we continue to run up against is just the problem with putting everything into a social theoretical framework to begin with.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, you're never going to get out of this vicious circle of societies produce knowledge, and the dominant social group in a society that produces the most knowledge then shapes the society in which we live, and everything just being a social construct by the most powerful group, and so on and so forth. I mean, we can never get out of this. You know, we just keep running around in circles and talking about our experiences, but never having anything beyond those experiences, either as individuals or groups, to explain them or adjudicate them.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to what you've been saying.
It can't be science because the scientist doing the brain scans has been socialized.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be, and I really don't think it can be religion, because you know, any ascription of any experience to something transcendent outside of the experience itself that would help us interpret the experience is a product of society.
Yeah, well, I think this is what you've been saying with Taylor. I think it's Taylor's work. I mean, once you deny, I mean, and I think this is why the Imago Dei is so important, at least into the Christian worldview, and has been such a culturally powerful idea, is it basically says the individual has access to the transcendent in some way. It could be through moral values. It could be about the design of the world itself as a product of creation. I mean, it produces so much. I mean, the moral reformer makes sense.
Yeah.
And in a CRT view, it doesn't seem like the moral reformer can make sense if you have social attribution to the entire society.
So he goes on to then take it into the political realm here at the end and talks about Republicans and Democrats playing off of these social identities and lived racialized experiences so as to gain or maintain political power. Republicans employ the Southern strategy, which he should have linked to that, but he didn't, because I don't think
No.
the Southern strategy was as simple as the idea of winning white male votes and establishing a white party. I don't think Nixon would have said that.
I don't
You
know.
know,
I need to do more research. I mean, even when you do research on Southern strategy, there's not a lot of consensus on when it began. And I mean, there's like, oh, well, they think it began with Nixon, but
right.
what were the policies? Was it successful? How do you measure it? I think honestly, I mean, it
And then
seems like the
yeah.
argument is something like, if, again, this is the entire like ascribing to society beliefs that aren't necessarily representative of the individuals. Basically, the argument seems to go is, oh, the South votes Republican, and we know there was an idea to make the Republicans vote in the South because of racial reasons. Therefore, everyone who votes in the South is racist. Again, these society-wide descriptions of beliefs seem to not hold water in any form. Even when you say like the West is Christian, like what does that mean?
Yeah.
Oh, there's Catholics, there's Protestants.
Yeah.
They have so many different denominations. I mean, what do you mean by that? They recognize Christ as some important feature of their life. Well, atheists are willing to say that.
And then he says that, and I guess the Clintons are a target for even critical race theorists and more conservative Christians like ourselves. The Clintons are a common target for both groups. But he says the Clintons playing up racist fears of blacks during their campaigns, and that both parties trade in racist rhetoric.
But then again, I mean, the question could be: how is this representative of CRT? I mean, if racism is defined by like the cultural powers, and that can be ascribed society. I mean, it's again, like you said at the very beginning, if you have a distinction in class, is it the majority of the population or is it those who are controlling politics?
Exactly.
Defines race through social interaction. And if the ones that are in power define it one way, then at what point is there legitimacy to define it another way?
Right.
I don't know.
Well,
in their view, and I want to make that clear, is, I mean, we're trying to figure out how they can address these issues in a framework that has the fundamental value of human persons through the Imago Dei. You have a way to navigate this.
So here's something I was thinking about this morning to finish up here with this particular essay. Last night I rented the classic movie, Academy Award winning movie, The Right Stuff, about the seven, the Mercury astronauts, the first seven Americans who went up to space. Alan Shepard was the first. I think Gordon Cooper was the last of the seven to go up. I think John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, they were all white heterosexual males, for sure. Now, I'm sure since then we've had several black male astronauts. We know we've had several female, and so and probably every racial group in space. But years ago, before I joined the military, I was thinking of becoming a public high school teacher for the Chicago Public Schools. And I remember writing an essay for one of the standardized tests on space exploration. You had to write an essay like in 30 minutes on whether or not America should dedicate more funds to NASA for space exploration or not, something like this. Yeah. And I kind of made the point, and this was 15 years ago, that it seems like nobody was really interested in space anymore. That all we were interested in now were social and domestic issues. And, as my thinking has developed on this, and after watching that movie last night, it reminded me of, we kind of, I feel, again, speculation here, that we've really kind of come to a place where there's no great endeavor anymore. We're not going to explore much of space. There's no way to do it. It's not a possibility, I mean, there was that movie with Brad Pitt last year, Ad Astra, where they get out to Neptune, and but space is just empty space. There's nothing out there, right? I mean, we feel like there's sort of no noble project, endeavor, goal. Maybe some people are still trying to cure cancer, but more and more we're just trying to manage cancer. There might be medical issues. Like, I think that's why COVID was so big of an issue, because it sort of gave us something.
Gave purpose of
right.
Got to overcome this as
so
together. Yeah.
The space race to me and the civil rights movement of the 1960s are kind of like the last two things I can point. One more modernist and one more metaphysical or physical, one more social, right? These two great endeavors that the whole world was sort of involved in, right? The space race being more a competitive thing between the Soviets and the U.S., and trying to attain these high aspirations and goals and push the boundaries of known reality.
Yeah.
I don't think we have that anymore right now. There's nothing like that.
I mean, the only one is like climate change would be the only one I think that they're trying to. Yeah. But I mean, you have to ask the question. I mean, this is probably the same reason why like a lot of these grand endeavors aren't being taken up. You have to answer the question, why? Like, okay, say we're successful. We make it to Neptune, or we make it to Mars, or we save the planet for a few more years. Like, why is that important now?
Yeah.
Well, it's important for our children, but what are they going to do? The same thing?
Yeah.
Like, I think maybe this is just a bigger problem with where we're at now, is there's no transcendent value that is worth living for the individual almost.
And there really is no more, I think, sense of what is the telos or the end goal of our scientific and social endeavors.
Yeah.
So I think, but the human heart needs some cause, right? And I think what CRT is doing is acting as a replacement, and we've touched on as a replacement religion, to give us something to do that seems grand in our own eyes, that allows us to either act morally or sinfully, and try and fix not just a perceived problem, because there's still like poverty in the world. There's still like problems of like fatherless homes, violence in the inner cities. These are all real things that need to be handled. But I think what this framework does, going back to like Shelby Steele's film, What Killed Michael Brown, it tries to give us sort of a poetic fiction to work off of, where we can feel like there is some grand cause that we're a part of. I think climate change would be the other one. It seems to be social justice, racial justice, and climate change are the two, not competing, but the two things on the table right now. And I think again, very speculative here, for a lot of Christians who want to get, but again, I think of what one of our colleagues at Biola told me in private last year, speaking about this, and he knows a lot about this subject, that people who are really getting into critical race theory, really embracing it and advocating for it, when they tend to get pressed on things like the sufficiency of the Bible, or even the sufficiency of the atonement, and there's a sort of a general sort of like, we know all that, we know the whole Christian story already, we get it, but we need more, we want more. And again, I'm not ascribing that to Nathan, but I feel that this could be for any of us, that we can shift towards this place where we really don't believe that there are transcendent goods to be had, and that those are the primary things. We just don't.
And I think this is where Nietzsche, and even Esselin's article that you sent to me, was so important, is it highlights that when you see these inversion of values, I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a very much inversion of values from the individual to the collective, putting up victimhood over triumph.
Mm-hmm.
It starts out as people seeing the things around them as bad, and that they can't do anything about it. And maybe that's kind of the next step, is once you no longer have this sort of grand endeavor, then there's nothing to fix. So then you just see bad things and nothing you can do about it. So then you try to create something different. And that's going to be the new goal. And that's the thing that we're going to fight for. Whether it's good or not is almost secondary to the
Exactly.
to purpose.
The
I mean,
process of
it's really the starvation of purpose and meaning.
Yeah. And that's
is what you're
something
saying.
that Alistair McIntyre, and I've referenced this book, Marxism and Christianity, that he wrote in 1968 when he was still a socialist. He points that out. It's kind of this problem of sort of having to deconstruct the world you live in because you see problems, and saying that we have this better idea, but we can't really say what it is until we get there, but then not really knowing what it is at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Not really knowing what the goal is, because again, we're trying to recreate ourselves at any given minute. It's kind of like a human version of occasionalism, where we're trying to recreate the universe, moment by moment.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that sort of more abstract, highfalutin note, I think we'll end this section here, and then we will have one more episode on part 3 of Dr. Cartagena's essay, where he goes on about what he thinks the church in the U.S. especially is getting wrong on critical race theory. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.